The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as King Charles stood by his study window, watching the early commuters rush past the iron gates. His coffee had grown cold in his hands, but he barely noticed. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, seemed heavier these days. At 75, he had waited longer than any heir in British history to assume the throne, and, now that he had it, the responsibilities felt overwhelming. His phone buzzed on the mahogany desk behind him. Another message from his private secretary about the day's schedule. 3 meetings with government ministers, a charity event in the afternoon, and dinner with foreign dignitaries. The same routine that had defined his life for decades. Yet somehow it all felt different now that he was king. Charles turned from the window and picked up a photograph from his desk. It showed him and William during happier times, when William was just a boy, both of them laughing as they fed ducks at a pond in Scotland. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago. The relationship between father and son had grown increasingly strained over the past few years, and Charles knew exactly why. The troubles had started long before he became king, but they had intensified dramatically since the coronation. William had always been protective of his mother's memory, and while he had eventually accepted Charles's marriage to Camilla, there remained an underlying tension that neither man seemed able to address directly. Public appearances showed a united royal family, but behind palace walls, conversations between Charles and William were formal, cold, and limited to official business. Charles remembered the last time they had spoken privately. It was 3 months ago, just after William had made some pointed comments to the press about the importance of transparency in the royal family. The words had been carefully chosen, but Charles knew they were directed at him and Camilla. William had always suspected there were things about their relationship that had never been fully revealed, secrets that went deeper than the public already knew. The official story was well known. Charles and Camilla had been friends for decades, had both married other people, and had eventually found their way back to each other after their respective divorces. The public had largely accepted this narrative, especially after seeing how happy Charles seemed with Camilla. But William had always sensed there was more to the story, details that had been carefully omitted from the public record. Camilla entered the study, carrying fresh coffee and wearing the concerned expression that Charles had come to know well. She had an uncanny ability to sense when something was troubling him, even when he tried to hide it. After nearly 20 years of marriage, she could read his moods better than anyone. "You're thinking about William again," she said, setting the coffee down and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a question. She had seen that particular look of worry and regret too many times before. Charles nodded slowly. "I received another report from the staff yesterday. He's been asking questions again, making inquiries about old records, requesting access to correspondence from the 80s and 90s. He's not going to let this go, Camilla." "Perhaps it's time," she said quietly. "We've been carrying this burden for so long. Maybe it would be better if everything came out into the open." Charles felt his stomach tighten. The secret they had been keeping wasn't just about the timeline of their relationship. It was something far more significant, something that could potentially shake the very foundations of the monarchy if it came to light. They had convinced themselves over the years that keeping it hidden was for the good of the institution, for the stability of the realm. But as time passed, the weight of the secret had only grown heavier. "You don't understand what this could mean," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If William learns the truth about what really happened during those years, about the real reason Diana was so hurt, about what we did," he couldn't finish the sentence. The truth was that Charles and Camilla's relationship had never really ended, not even during his marriage to Diana. While the public believed they had been apart during the 1980s, they had actually maintained contact throughout Charles's marriage. Not just casual friendship, but a deep, ongoing emotional and sometimes physical relationship that had continued even as Diana struggled with the isolation and pain that would eventually define her public image. But there was more. During one particularly difficult period in Charles and Diana's marriage, when Diana was battling severe depression and had threatened to expose what she knew about Charles and Camilla. Certain people within the royal establishment had taken steps to discredit her. They had quietly encouraged the media narrative that Diana was unstable, that her claims about Charles's ongoing relationship with Camilla were the products of a troubled mind. Camilla had been directly involved in these efforts. She had provided information about Diana's emotional state to palace advisors, had helped craft strategies to undermine Diana's credibility, and had even maintained friendships with certain journalists who were sympathetic to Charles's position. It was a coordinated campaign to protect the heir to the throne, but it had come at the devastating cost of isolating Diana further and contributing to her mental health struggles. The most damaging revelation would be the letters. During the worst period of Charles and Diana's marriage, Camilla had written detailed letters to close friends describing Diana's behavior, her emotional outbursts, her struggles with eating disorders. These letters had been shown to select members of the press and royal correspondents, always with the understanding that they were confidential background information. But they had shaped the narrative around Diana in ways that were profoundly unfair and damaging. Charles walked to his safe and withdrew a manila envelope that he had kept hidden for decades. Inside were photocopies of some of Camilla's letters, along with memos from palace staff detailing the media strategy that had been employed. He had kept them as a form of insurance, never intending to use them, but also unable to destroy the evidence of what they had done. "William is so much like his mother," Charles said, holding the envelope. "He has the same determination, the same unwillingness to accept simple answers when he suspects there's more to discover. Diana always said she would find out the truth about us, and now William is following in her footsteps." Camilla sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs by the fireplace. She had aged gracefully, but the stress of keeping their secret was beginning to show in the lines around her eyes, the way her hands occasionally trembled when she thought no one was looking. "Do you remember what you told me when we decided to keep this quiet?" she asked. "You said that protecting the monarchy was more important than our personal comfort, that the institution had to come first always." Charles did remember. It was 1997, just months after Diana's death. The public outpouring of grief had been unprecedented, and there had been serious questions about whether the monarchy would survive. Charles and Camilla had made the decision then to bury the truth about their role in Diana's suffering, to present a sanitized version of their relationship that the public could eventually accept. They had waited 8 years before marrying, carefully managing public opinion, slowly introducing Camilla to royal duties. By the time of their wedding in 2005, most people had accepted their relationship as a late-in-life love story. The truth about the ongoing deception during Charles's first marriage, about the calculated efforts to undermine Diana, remained hidden. But at what cost? Charles asked now. "We lost William. We lost Harry completely. The family has been fractured for years, and it's all because of what we did, what we covered up." The irony was not lost on either of them. Charles had spent decades preparing to be king, studying constitutional law, visiting Commonwealth nations, building relationships with world leaders. But his personal relationships, the very foundation of what the monarchy represented, had crumbled under the weight of deception. William's investigation was becoming more sophisticated. He had hired private researchers, former journalists who specialized in royal coverage from the 1980s and 1990s. He was methodically going through public records, cross-referencing dates and events, building a timeline that was getting uncomfortably close to the truth. Just last week, one of Charles's former private secretaries had contacted him. William had approached the man directly, asking specific questions about Camilla's role during the period of Charles and Diana's separation. The former secretary had remained loyal, but he had warned Charles that William was asking exactly the right questions, pursuing precisely the leads that could uncover everything. "There's something else," Camilla said, her voice so quiet Charles had to strain to hear her. "I received a call yesterday from Janet Morrison." Charles felt his blood run cold. Janet Morrison had been one of Camilla's closest friends during the 1980s, one of the women who had received the damaging letters about Diana. She had moved to Australia decades ago, and they had rarely spoken since. What did she want? Someone has been asking questions about the old days. A researcher claiming to work for a documentary about the royal family in the 1980s. But Janet thinks it might be connected to William's inquiries. She wanted to know what she should do if they approach her directly. Charles realized that his hands were shaking. The web of secrecy they had maintained for so long was beginning to unravel, and there was very little they could do to stop it. William had resources, determination, and, most importantly, he had the moral authority that came from being Diana's son. If he chose to make their deception public, there would be few people willing to defend Charles and Camilla. "We have to tell him ourselves," Charles said suddenly, "before he discovers it on his own. If it comes from us, if we explain the context, the pressures we were under, maybe he can understand." Camilla looked doubtful. "You think he'll forgive us for what we did to his mother?" "I don't know. But I know that if he finds out on his own, if he feels we deceived him right up until the end, there will be no possibility of reconciliation. And without William, without the next generation, what's the point of any of this?" Charles gestured around the room, at the portraits of his ancestors, at the symbols of centuries of royal tradition. The monarchy has survived wars, scandals, constitutional crises, but it has never survived the complete breakdown of the family at its center. They sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the sounds of London continued: traffic, construction, the distant sound of the siren. Life went on for millions of people who had no idea that the stability of their constitutional monarchy was hanging in the balance of a family conversation that had been postponed for far too long. Finally, Charles picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found William's private number. His finger hovered over the call button for a long moment. Once he made this call, once he started down the path of full disclosure, there would be no turning back. Their carefully constructed narrative would crumble, and they would have to face the consequences of choices they had made decades ago. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was watching William discover the truth on his own, feeling betrayed not just by the original deception, but by years of continued lies. The alternative was the complete destruction of any remaining relationship with his son and heir. Charles took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, William answered. "Hello, Father." The formality in William's voice was unmistakable. No warmth, no curiosity about why his father might be calling. Just the careful politeness of a man speaking to someone he no longer trusted. "William, I need to speak with you. In person. Today, if possible." There was a pause. "Is everything all right? Is this about official business?" "No," Charles said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. "This is about your mother. This is about things that happened a long time ago that you have a right to know." William sat in his Range Rover outside Clarence House, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The phone call from his father had ended 2 hours ago, but he was still trying to process what he had heard. After years of careful distance, years of polite but cold interactions, Charles was finally ready to talk about Diana. About what really happened during those dark years of the 1980s and 1990s. The security guard recognized him immediately and waved him through the gates. William had been coming to Clarence House since he was a child, but today felt different. Today felt like the end of something, though he wasn't sure what. As he walked up the familiar steps to the front entrance, he tried to prepare himself for whatever revelations awaited him inside. Charles was waiting for him in the same study where they had conducted so many formal meetings over the years. But today his father looked older, more fragile than William had ever seen him. The weight of the crown had always been heavy, but today Charles seemed to be carrying something even heavier. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Charles said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I know you're busy." William took the offered seat, noting that Camilla was not present. In recent years, she had made a point of being nearby whenever William visited, as if her presence could somehow bridge the gap between father and son. Her absence today felt significant. "You said this was about Mother," William said without preamble. "What about her?" Charles reached for the manila envelope he had shown Camilla earlier. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the desk between them. Before I show you what's in here, I need you to understand the context of that time. The pressure we were all under, the impossible situation we found ourselves in. What kind of impossible situation could justify lying to your children for 30 years? William's voice was controlled, but Charles could hear the anger beneath the surface. Your mother was struggling, Charles began carefully. The marriage was failing, and she was having serious mental health difficulties. The press was relentless. The public scrutiny was unlike anything the royal family had ever experienced. We were all trying to protect the institution while also protecting the people we cared about. William leaned forward. Get to the point, father. What did you do? Charles opened the envelope and withdrew a stack of papers. Letters, memos, newspaper clippings, all carefully preserved for decades. The public story about my relationship with Camilla is not complete. We never stopped seeing each other, not even during my marriage to your mother. This was not news to William. He had suspected as much for years, and various biographers and journalists had hinted at the ongoing relationship. But seeing his father finally admit it directly felt like a punch to the stomach. That's not all, Charles continued. When your mother began to suspect the extent of our relationship, when she started to talk about going public with what she knew, certain people within the palace establishment became concerned about the damage it could do to the monarchy. William felt his heart rate accelerating. What kind of damage? Your mother had evidence. Photographs, letters, phone records. She had documented proof that Camilla and I had never really separated. But more than that, she had begun to piece together how extensive our deception had been. She knew about meetings we had claimed never happened, about trips where we had been together while telling her we were apart. Charles handed William one of the documents from the envelope. It was a memo from a palace press secretary, dated 1992, outlining a strategy for managing the Diana situation. William read it quickly, his face growing pale as he absorbed the contents. They wanted to make her look crazy, William said, his voice barely above a whisper. They wanted to discredit her before she could tell her story. The concern was that if your mother went public with everything she knew, it would destroy the monarchy, Charles said. The institution that has provided stability for this country for over 1,000 years. The decision was made to protect that institution, whatever the cost. Whatever the cost, William repeated. And what was the cost exactly? Charles handed him another document. This one was a letter in Camilla's handwriting, dated September 1993, addressed to a close friend. In it, Camilla described Diana's emotional state in clinical detail, noting her eating disorders, her mood swings, her periods of deep depression. But the tone was not sympathetic. It was calculating, analytical, as if Diana were a problem to be solved rather than a human being in pain. Camilla wrote these letters to several people, Charles explained. Close friends, but also people who had connections to the media. The information was used to shape the narrative around your mother. When she made claims about our relationship, about the way she was being treated, there was already a foundation laid for dismissing her as emotionally unstable. William read through more of the letters, each one more devastating than the last. Camilla had documented Diana's lowest moments with the detachment of a scientist studying a laboratory specimen. Details about Diana's bulimia, about her self-harm, about her desperate attempts to save her marriage, all reduced to gossip shared with friends who would pass it along to the right people. This is why the press always seemed to know so much about Mother's personal struggles, William said. It wasn't because they were good at investigating. It was because you were feeding them information. Not directly, Charles said weakly. But, yes, information was shared through unofficial channels. The goal was to create a context where if your mother made accusations about the royal family, they could be dismissed as the products of a disturbed mind. William stood up abruptly and walked to the window, the same window where Charles had been standing that morning. The afternoon sun was now casting different shadows across the garden, but William barely noticed. He was trying to process the magnitude of what his father had just revealed. She knew, didn't she? William said finally. Mother knew that people were working against her, that her own husband's mistress was documenting her pain and sharing it with the world. Charles nodded silently, and that's why she was so paranoid in those final years. That's why she talked about feeling like everyone was conspiring against her, because they actually were. We thought we were protecting the monarchy, Charles said. We thought we were making the best of an impossible situation. You destroyed her, William said, his voice filled with a cold fury that Charles had never heard before. You systematically destroyed my mother's credibility, her reputation, her mental health, all to protect your relationship with Camilla. It wasn't that simple. It was exactly that simple. William turned around to face his father, and Charles saw an expression of disgust that cut him to the core. You could have been honest. You could have admitted the marriage was over, gotten divorced, and married Camilla. Instead, you chose to torment Mother for years while building a case to make her look insane. Charles tried to find words that could explain the complexity of the situation, the pressure they had been under, the advice they had received from constitutional experts who warned that a messy royal divorce could threaten the stability of the government itself. But, looking at his son's face, he realized that no explanation would ever be adequate. There's more, Charles said quietly. The letters, the media strategy, that was all devastating enough. But there was one incident, one specific moment that I think you need to know about. William sat back down, his face pale but resolute. Tell me, in 1995, your mother gave that interview to Martin Bashir on Panorama, the one where she said there were 3 people in her marriage. I remember. What you don't know is that she originally planned to reveal much more. She had intended to show some of the evidence she had collected about our relationship with Camilla. Photographs, correspondence, phone records. It would have been devastating. William waited for his father to continue. The night before the interview was scheduled to air, your mother received a phone call. Someone warned her that if she went ahead with her planned revelations, there would be consequences for you and Harry. Not physical threats, but suggestions that your futures within the royal family could be affected. Who made the call? Charles hesitated. We were never able to prove it definitively, but we believed it came from someone close to Camilla. Someone who had access to the information about what your mother planned to reveal. William felt sick, so Mother held back. She protected us instead of exposing the truth. She did. The interview was damaging enough, but it could have been much worse. Your mother chose to sacrifice her chance for vindication in order to protect you and Harry from potential retaliation. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. William stared at the documents spread across his father's desk, evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped his entire childhood, his understanding of his parents' marriage, his relationship with both his father and stepmother. Does Camilla know you're telling me this? William asked. Yes. She agreed that it was time for the truth to come out. She's prepared to face whatever consequences follow. And what consequences do you think should follow? William's voice was dangerously quiet. Charles realized he had no answer for that question. For years, he and Camilla had lived with the secret, telling themselves that they had acted in the best interests of the monarchy. But faced with his son's pain and anger, those justifications seemed hollow. I want to see her, William said suddenly. I want to hear this from Camilla herself. William, I'm not sure I want to look her in the eye while she explains how she justified destroying my mother's life. I want to understand how someone could be so calculating, so cruel, and then live with themselves for decades afterward. Charles realized there was no point in trying to protect Camilla from this confrontation. William would have this conversation with her eventually, and it would be better if it happened in a controlled environment rather than in some public setting where it could become a spectacle. She's upstairs, Charles said. She's been waiting. William stood up and walked toward the door, then paused. One more question, Father. Did you ever love my mother? Even for a moment, was there ever anything real between you? Charles felt tears forming in his eyes. Yes. In the beginning, I thought I could learn to love her the way she deserved. But I never stopped loving Camilla, and your mother deserved better than someone who was only half present in the marriage. Then, you should have let her go, William said. You should have let her find someone who could love her completely instead of trapping her in a marriage where she was always competing with a ghost. William left the study and climbed the stairs to find Camilla. Behind him, Charles sat alone among the evidence of choices made long ago, choices that had protected the institution of monarchy while destroying the human relationships at its heart. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over London, and Charles wondered if this day marked the sunset of something much larger than just the end of another royal day. Camilla was sitting in the blue drawing room when William found her. She had chosen this particular room deliberately. It had been one of Diana's favorites during the brief periods when she had visited Clarence's house in the early years of her marriage. The irony was not lost on either of them as William entered and took a seat across from her. "So, Camilla said simply, how you convinced yourself that what you were doing was acceptable." Camilla was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind countless times over the years, but now that it was actually happening, the words seemed inadequate. "Do you have children, William?" she asked finally. "I do." "Then, you understand that there are lengths to which a parent will go to protect their child's future. Your father was the heir to the throne. His destiny was not his own choice. It was predetermined from birth. My job, as I saw it, was to protect that destiny. By destroying my mother? By protecting the institution that your father would one day lead, and that your children will one day inherit." William leaned forward, his eyes flashing with anger. "Don't you dare try to make this about my children. This was about your relationship with my father, and you were willing to sacrifice anyone who got in the way." Camilla sighed deeply. "You're right, of course. It was about Charles and me, but it was also about something larger than our personal happiness." She stood up and walked to a window that overlooked the garden. "In 1981, when your parents married, the monarchy was already under pressure. The country was changing, traditional institutions were being questioned, and there was a real concern about the relevance of the royal family in modern Britain. So you decided that my mother was the problem?" "Your mother was complex," Camilla said carefully. "She was beautiful, charismatic, and the public loved her. But she was also deeply troubled, and she had very little understanding of how the monarchy actually functioned, because no one bothered to teach her. That's true. The royal family failed her in many ways. But by the late 1980s, when her marriage to your father was clearly breaking down, she had become unpredictable. She was talking to journalists, making threats about what she might reveal, and there was genuine concern that she could bring down the entire system." William stood up as well, pacing to the other side of the room. "So you decided to bring her down first. We decided to protect ourselves and the institution we served. We? This was your idea." Camilla was quiet for a moment. "I won't lie to you, William. Yes, much of the strategy was my idea. I had connections in the media world that Charles didn't have. I understood how to manage information, how to shape narratives. And I was motivated by love for your father and fear of what your mother might do to him." "What she might do to him?" William's voice rose. "She was his wife. She was the mother of his children. What could she possibly do that was worse than what you actually did to her? She could have exposed the full extent of our relationship during their marriage. She could have provided proof that would have made it impossible for Charles to ever become king. She could have destroyed the monarchy itself out of anger and pain." William stared at her in disbelief. "So you destroyed her first?" "I protected Charles, yes. And in doing so, I protected the institution that your children will one day inherit." "Let me understand this clearly," William said, his voice deadly calm. "You're telling me that you spent years documenting my mother's mental health struggles, sharing intimate details of her pain with journalists and friends, undermining her credibility at every turn, all because you were afraid she might tell the truth about her marriage. The truth would have been devastating. The truth was that my father never loved her the way she deserved to be loved. The truth was that he was in love with someone else throughout their entire marriage. The truth was that she was trapped in a relationship that was destroying her mental health. How is any of that worse than what you actually did to her?" Camilla returned to her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 76 years. Because the truth would have ended the monarchy as we know it. Maybe it should have. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Camilla stared at William, seeing Diana's fierce protectiveness of her children, her unwillingness to accept simple explanations when the truth was more complex. "You don't mean that," Camilla said finally. "Don't I? What good is an institution that can only survive by destroying innocent people? What kind of monarchy is worth preserving if it requires that level of deception and cruelty? It's the only system of government this country has ever known. It's provided stability through wars, economic crises, social upheaval. Whatever our personal failings, the institution itself has value." William sat back down, but his posture remained tense. "Tell me about the letters. The ones where you describe my mother's eating disorder, her depression, her self-harm. Tell me how you justified sharing those intimate details with people who would use them against her." Camilla closed her eyes for a moment. "Your mother was ill, William. Seriously ill. She needed help that she wasn't getting from the royal family's medical staff. I thought that if the right people understood the extent of her problems, they might be able to help her get proper treatment." Bullshit. The profanity came out with such force that Camilla actually flinched. "You weren't trying to help her. You were building a case for why she couldn't be trusted, why her accusations against Charles should be dismissed as the ravings of a mentally unstable woman. Both things can be true." "No, they can't. Not when you were simultaneously maintaining the relationship that was causing her so much pain. You can't claim you were trying to help her while you were also continuing to betray her." Camilla was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. I was protecting Charles, and I was protecting our relationship. Everything else was secondary." The honesty was startling, and for a moment William didn't know how to respond. He had expected continued justifications, more attempts to frame their actions as necessary for the greater good. The straightforward admission of selfishness was almost more difficult to process. "Why are you telling me this now?" William asked. "After all these years of keeping it secret, why reveal it now?" "Because you were getting close to discovering it on your own. And because Charles felt you deserved to hear it from us rather than piecing it together from old documents and interviews with people who were there. And because you thought if it came from you, I might be more likely to forgive you." Camilla met his eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. "I don't expect forgiveness, William. I'm not sure I deserve it. But I hope that understanding the full context might help you understand why we made the choices we did. The context is that you were selfish. You wanted to be with Charles, and you were willing to destroy anyone who got in the way. My mother, her reputation, her mental health, her relationship with her children, all of it was acceptable collateral damage as long as you got what you wanted. That's a harsh way to put it, but it's not entirely wrong." William stood up again and walked to a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II that hung on the wall. His grandmother had managed to maintain the dignity and stability of the monarchy through decades of family drama and public scrutiny. But she had done it without destroying anyone in the process. "Did the Queen know?" he asked without turning around. "Some of it. She knew about the ongoing relationship between Charles and me during his marriage to your mother. She disapproved, but she also understood that Charles was unlikely to change." "Did she know about the media strategy? About the letters?" "No. Your grandmother believed in handling family matters privately. She would never have approved of using the press as a weapon against a member of the family." William turned back to face Camilla. "But you did approve of it. You initiated it." "Yes. And you lived with it for decades. You attended family events. You smiled for photographs. You played the role of the loving stepmother, all while knowing what you had done to my mother. It wasn't easy. It wasn't supposed to be easy." William's composure finally cracked. "You destroyed a good woman's life. You contributed to the mental health crisis that defined her final years. You helped create the circumstances that made her feel so isolated and desperate that she was willing to give that television interview, knowing it might end her marriage. She gave that interview because she wanted to tell her side of the story. She gave that interview because she felt like it was the only way anyone would believe her. Because you had spent years making sure that whenever she tried to tell the truth about her marriage, people would dismiss her as crazy. Camilla had no response to that. It was true, and they both knew it. "There's something else you need to know," Camilla said quietly. "Something that might be even harder for you to hear." William felt his stomach drop. He had thought the revelations were complete, but apparently there was more. After your mother's death, after the funeral, there were discussions about how to handle the remaining evidence of what had happened during the marriage. Documents, recordings, photographs that could still damage the royal family if they came to light. What kind of discussions? There were suggestions that everything should be destroyed, that it would be better for everyone, including you and Harry, if the full truth never came out. And your father, and I decided to keep copies of the most important documents, not to use against anyone, but as a form of insurance. In case questions were ever raised about what really happened, we wanted to be able to control the narrative. William stared at her in disbelief. "You kept evidence of your own crimes as insurance?" "We kept evidence of a complex situation that could be interpreted many different ways." "Show me." "William, I don't think, show me everything. If we're going to have this conversation, if we're finally going to deal with the truth, then I want to see all of it." Camilla hesitated for a moment, then walked to a small desk in the corner of the room. She withdrew a key from her purse and unlocked a drawer, pulling out another manila envelope similar to the one Charles had shown him earlier. "These are the documents we kept," she said, handing him the envelope. Letters, memos, photographs, and recordings from the period between 1985 and 1996. William opened the envelope and began sorting through the contents. There were letters in his mother's handwriting, clearly written during periods of deep emotional distress. There were photographs of Charles and Camilla together during times when they had publicly claimed to be apart. There were transcripts of phone conversations between Charles and Camilla that had been recorded without Diana's knowledge. But the most devastating items were a series of audio recordings on small cassette tapes. The labels indicated they were recorded during family meetings, dinners, and private conversations between Charles and Diana. "You recorded her," William said, his voice barely audible. "You actually recorded my mother during private family moments. Not me directly, but yes, recordings were made. For what purpose? To document her emotional instability. To have evidence that could be used if she ever tried to make public accusations about her treatment by the royal family." William held up one of the tapes. The label read, "Diana, family dinner, March 1994, emotional outburst." "She knew, didn't she?" William said. "She knew she was being recorded, being watched, being documented. That's why she became so paranoid in those final years. She suspected, yes. And instead of stopping, instead of showing her some basic human decency, you continued to document her pain for your own protection." Camilla didn't respond. There was nothing she could say that would make any of it better. William carefully placed all the documents back in the envelope. "I want copies of everything. And I want a written account of everyone who was involved, everyone who knew, everyone who helped. What are you planning to do?" "I don't know yet. But I know that this conversation is just the beginning, not the end." 3 weeks after the confrontation at Clarence House, William sat in his private study at Kensington Palace, surrounded by documents, transcripts, and photographs that painted a devastating picture of his mother's final years. He had spent countless hours going through everything Camilla had given him, cross-referencing dates, verifying details, and slowly building a complete timeline of the campaign against Diana. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only had Charles and Camilla continued their relationship throughout his marriage to Diana, but they had actively worked to undermine her credibility when she began to suspect the truth. The scope of the deception was breathtaking, involving palace staff, media contacts, friends, and even some members of the extended royal family. Catherine found him there in the early morning hours, still hunched over the papers, his coffee long gone cold. She had been watching her husband struggle with the revelations for weeks, seeing how the truth about his mother's treatment was affecting not just his relationship with his father, but his entire understanding of the institution he would one day lead. "You need to eat something," she said gently, setting down a plate with toast and fresh coffee. And you need to sleep. I can't stop thinking about what she went through, William said without looking up from a transcript he was reading. This document shows that they were recording her private phone calls as early as 1989. She was trapped in that marriage for 7 more years, knowing that everything she said was being used against her. Catherine sat down in the chair across from his desk. What are you going to do with all this information? I don't know. Part of me wants to release everything. Let the public see exactly what kind of people they really are. But another part of me knows that would destroy the monarchy entirely. And how do you feel about that? William finally looked up from the papers. Honestly, some days I think the monarchy deserves to be destroyed. If this is what it takes to preserve the institution, if we can only survive by systematically destroying good people, then maybe it's not worth preserving. Catherine had never heard her husband speak this way about the royal family. Throughout their courtship and marriage, William had always expressed a sense of duty and responsibility toward his future role. But the revelations about his mother had shaken something fundamental in his worldview. What about George, Charlotte, and Louis? Catherine asked. What about their futures? That's what makes this so difficult, William admitted. I have to decide whether to sacrifice my children's inheritance in order to get justice for my mother. And I'm not sure there's a right answer. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. William glanced at the caller ID and saw it was Harry calling from California. The brothers had spoken several times since the revelations began, but those conversations had been strained and difficult. Harry's relationship with Charles had been virtually non-existent since he left royal duties, and learning about their father's role in Diana's suffering had only deepened his anger. It's Harry, William told Catherine before answering the call. Have you made a decision? Harry asked without preamble. About what? About whether you're going to tell the world what they did to Mom. William sighed. It's not that simple, Harry. It is exactly that simple. They destroyed our mother's life, and then they covered up for 30 years. The only question is whether you're going to let them get away with it. And what about the consequences? What about the impact on the entire royal family? What about George, Charlotte, and Louis? What about justice for Mom? What about making sure this never happens to anyone else? Harry, if we release this information, it won't just damage Charles and Camilla. It will destroy the entire institution. The monarchy might not survive this. Good. The word hung in the air between them. William had suspected this was how Harry would react, but hearing him say it directly was still jarring. You don't mean that, William said. I absolutely mean it. What good is a system that can only survive by destroying innocent people? What kind of legacy do we want to leave for our children? William looked at Catherine, who was listening to the conversation with growing concern. Harry, we need to think about this carefully. There are millions of people who depend on the stability that the monarchy provides. And there was one person who depended on the protection that her marriage should have provided, and we all know how that worked out. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but neither brother moved from their positions. Harry wanted complete disclosure and was willing to accept the destruction of the monarchy as a consequence. William was torn between his desire for justice for his mother and his sense of duty to the institution he would one day lead. After hanging up, William and Catherine sat in silence for several minutes. The early morning sun was beginning to filter through the windows of Kensington Palace, the same palace where Diana had lived during her separation from Charles, where she had given that devastating interview to Martin Bashir, where she had planned her new life as a single mother. What would your mother want? Catherine asked finally. I've been asking myself that question for weeks, William said. On one hand, she would want the truth to come out. She spent years trying to tell her story, trying to make people understand what she was going through. On the other hand, she always said that her primary concern was protecting Harry and me. And now you have to protect your own children. Exactly. If I expose everything, George will inherit a country where the monarchy has been completely discredited. Is that fair to him? Catherine stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where Diana had once played with her sons. Maybe the question isn't what's fair to George. Maybe the question is what kind of institution you want him to inherit. William joined her at the window. What do you mean? If the monarchy can only survive by covering up terrible crimes, by destroying people who get in the way, then it's already broken. Maybe the only way to fix it is to rebuild it from the ground up, based on truth and accountability rather than deception and cover-ups. That's a nice ideal, but the practical reality is that constitutional monarchy is deeply embedded in British society. The government, the military, the legal system, the Church of England, they're all connected to the crown. You can't just tear it all down and start over. Maybe you can't tear it all down, Catherine said, but maybe you can force it to change. William looked at her with interest. How? What if you released the information, but coupled it with a demand for fundamental reforms? What if you used this crisis as an opportunity to modernize the monarchy, to make it more transparent and accountable? You think the public would accept that? I think the public would respect honesty more than they would respect continued cover-ups. And I think they would appreciate a royal family that was willing to confront its past mistakes rather than hiding from them. William considered this for a moment. It was an interesting approach, but it would require careful planning and coordination. He couldn't just dump all the evidence on the press and hope for the best. He would need to control the narrative, to present a vision for what the monarchy could become rather than just exposing what it had been. There's something else to consider, Catherine continued. If you don't release this information, what happens when someone else finds it? You're not the only person investigating your mother's story. There are journalists, historians, people who were there at the time. Eventually, pieces of this will come out anyway. But if it comes from me, I can control how it's presented. Exactly. William walked back to his desk and looked at the stacks of documents. Among them was a letter Diana had written to a friend in 1995, just months before her death. In it, she described feeling completely isolated and under constant surveillance. She wrote about her fear that no one will ever believe me and her determination to find a way to tell the truth about what really happened. She wanted the truth to come out, William said, holding up the letter. Even knowing the consequences, even understanding that it might destroy her own children's futures, she wanted people to know what had been done to her. Then, maybe that's her answer. William sat back down at his desk and pulled out a legal pad. If I'm going to do this, I need to do it right. I need lawyers, public relations experts, constitutional scholars. I need to present a complete plan for reforming the monarchy, not just tear it down. And you need to talk to your father. William looked up sharply. What? If you're going to give Charles and Camilla a chance to respond, to explain themselves publicly, then you need to tell them what you're planning to do. They deserve that much. After what they did to my mother, they don't deserve anything. Maybe not, but you deserve to be the kind of person who does the right thing, even when dealing with people who haven't done the right thing. William knew she was right. As much as he hated Charles and Camilla for what they had done, he couldn't become the kind of person who would ambush them without warning. If he was going to expose their crimes, he would do it honorably. I'll call him, William said. But first, I want to have everything prepared. I want to have a complete plan for what comes next, not just evidence of what happened before. Over the next week, William assembled a team of advisors unlike any the royal family had ever employed. Instead of the traditional courtiers and civil servants who usually managed royal affairs, he brought in reform advocates, constitutional lawyers who specialized in transparency laws, and public relations experts who had experience managing crisis communications for organizations rebuilding after major scandals. The plan they developed was radical by royal standards. William would release the complete evidence of the campaign against Diana, but he would do so as part of a comprehensive reform package that would fundamentally change how the monarchy operated. There would be new transparency requirements, independent oversight of royal finances, and formal protections for anyone who raised concerns about royal family conduct. Most importantly, there would be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, similar to those established in post-apartheid South Africa, where victims of royal family misconduct could tell their stories and receive official acknowledgement of the harm done to them. When the plan was complete, William called his father. "I need to see you," he said when Charles answered. Both you and Camilla. I made some decisions about how to handle the information you shared with me. William, I hope you'll consider. Father, I've already considered everything. The decision is made. The only question now is whether you want to know what's coming so you can prepare for it. They met again at Clarence House, in the same study where Charles had first revealed the truth 3 weeks earlier. But this time, William brought his own manila envelope, thick with documents outlining his reform plan and the timeline for releasing the evidence about Diana. "You're going to destroy us," Charles said after reading through William's proposal. "You destroyed yourselves," William replied. "I'm just making sure that when the truth comes out, something better can be built from the wreckage." Camilla had been silent throughout the meeting, but now she looked up at William with something that might have been respect. "You're going to be a very different kind of king than your father. If I become king at all," William said. "After this comes out, the British people might decide they've had enough of the whole system. And you're prepared for that. I'm prepared for the consequences of telling the truth. Whatever those consequences might be." Charles set down the documents and looked at his son with an expression of profound sadness. "I spent my entire life preparing to be king, and now I'm going to be remembered as the man who destroyed the monarchy." "You'll be remembered as the man whose crimes came to light," William corrected. "How you're ultimately judged will depend on how you respond to that." "What do you mean?" William leaned forward. "The reform package includes provisions for a formal apology process. If you're genuinely sorry for what you did to my mother, if you're willing to acknowledge the full extent of the harm you caused, then you have the opportunity to be part of rebuilding something better. And if we're not willing, then you'll be remembered as criminals who were exposed and removed from power. The choice is yours." Charles and Camilla exchanged glances. They had spent decades building carefully constructed public personas, and now they faced the choice between voluntary destruction of those personas or involuntary destruction combined with complete disgrace. When Charles asked finally, "The press conference is scheduled for next month. You'll have 2 weeks advance notice, so you can prepare your own response. And there's nothing we could do to change your mind?" William stood up to leave. "You had 30 years to change my mind, Father. You could have told the truth at any point. You could have acknowledged what you did and worked to make amends. Instead, you continued to lie, even to your own children. That time is over." As William walked out of Clarence House for what he knew would likely be the last time as a member of the same royal family as his father, he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time since learning the truth about his mother's treatment, he felt like he was honoring her memory in a way that mattered. Diana had always said that she wanted to be remembered as the people's princess. Now, finally, the people would know exactly what had been done to their princess and by whom. And, more importantly, they would have the opportunity to build something better from the ashes of the institution that had failed her so completely.